Gladys is in a mess of a marriage because one of the aristocratic families that went broke decided to marry a dollar princess to sustain their lifestyle and estate. But the reason the titled British men turned penniless to the point they had to be saved with marriage is a crazy tale that you would find insane. The European aristocrats weren't shy about bargaining for dowries they would get from their brides because that's mostly what was in it for them. Money was essential to saving a title that could no longer afford or maintain its resources. And the crazy part, it was unheard of for an aristocrat to take a job or profession for money, so working wasn't a choice for the Duke. But then how did they get it all wrong? Before the 19th century, British titled families were wealthy and very comfortable, living off the profits from farming tenants. They were rich and blessed with landed wealth, as they were landowners who rented out their lands to farmers without doing any work themselves. The nobles also sold the natural resources on their farms, such as minerals and game, for money. At the time, a typical peer could earn approximately £75,000 a year, equivalent to £7.7 million today, and the dukes received even higher salaries, as their wealth was measured according to their rank. So, a duke could get more than £175,000 in 1 year, which amounts to a large sum of about £18 million in today's rates. There was also a benefit to the nobles, as they weren't just landowners but also dominated the government and controlled the House of Lords. Most of them were also very consistent in the House of Commons, so the nobles had a lot of say in how things were handled in society. However, even more amusing is that Britain was one of the least governed countries in history, a phenomenon that played out before the 19th century. Their government at the time barely enforced any rules on the nobles, who mostly lived and owned properties in the countryside and were not heavily taxed. So the wealthy aristocrats, earning massive profits from their farmlands, lived almost tax-free without any trouble. In the 19th century, which the Gilded Age is set in, the British aristocracy was still very wealthy in the early and mid-19th century, with the growth of nearly 10 million acres of cereals and other crops planted by the tenant farmers. However, things began to shift in the late 19th century as the wealth and prosperity earned from these farmlands drastically reduced and became non-existent due to the Great Depression of British agriculture. But the problem didn't just start with the Depression. The issue began with a market force that originated from the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, which meant a lifting of food import tariffs in the name of free trade. In the late 1800s, significant changes began to occur rapidly. Thanks to faster shipping and machines working on farms overseas, particularly in the United States, Britain started to import cheap corn and meat. Early in the United States, Britain started to import cheap corn and meat. Britain started to import cheap corn and meat. With corn prices hitting rock bottom, farmers abandoned attempts to grow crops on poorer soil. Instead of planting grass properly, many simply let the land go to waste. Before 1900, wheat fields had shrunk to half their size in the mid-1880s. Even livestock farming took a hit. Foreign producers could raise beef and sheep more cheaply, so local farmers were at a disadvantage. As farms became less profitable, the wealthy landowners who once showed off their productive estates also started going broke. This was the nobles' primary source of income, and it dried up right before their eyes as the tenants either completely abandoned the farms or negotiated lower rents. As farms became less profitable, the wealthy landowners who once showed off their productive estates also started going broke. This was the nobles' primary source of income, and it dried up right before their eyes as the tenants. As farms became less profitable, the cities also contributed to sustaining what was left of the farms in the countryside, which helped the farming industry. The growing industrial towns had numerous horses, which resulted in large quantities of manure. Farmers used this as a natural fertilizer to keep their soil exceptionally rich and productive for growing fruits and flowers in horticulture. But not everything turned out well in the end. As the 1800s drew to a close, many farm workers left the countryside for better city jobs. Only the toughest and most most determined farmers managed to keep going strong, but with very little encouragement to continue. So, the farmers took charge of their lives to find and train for other jobs, but the aristocrats who owned the lands were stuck. They couldn't find employment because it would have been a great scandal if they did. Yet, they needed to maintain their appearances, keep up their estates, and continue to appear royal and superior to the working-class members of society, which led many into debt. They had a costly lifestyle, making it a tough adjustment, so they became broke and in debt with no solution or help. With their primary source of income gone, their remaining savings also diminished rapidly. The industrialists began to take over power and had a say in the government, unlike the nobles, who had traditionally held the same privilege. As Britain grew more industrial, running and protecting the country got expensive. To cover the cost, the government raised taxes, and since Parliament was now filled with people who supported business and factories, they had no problem targeting the wealthy landowners who were facing significant challenges and were struggling to stay financially afloat. This was a significant shift in that era, as money and power were moving away from the countryside and into the hands of industry. However, it became worse than that. Their inheritance, which had once made many envious of them, soon became a curse with the introduction of death duties, a game-changing tax introduced in the late 1800s. Whenever a wealthy landowner died, their heirs were now required to pay a substantial tax to inherit the estate, and it wasn't cheap. These taxes could wipe out substantial portions of the family fortune, especially when land was tied up and challenging to sell. To make matters worse, these aristocratic families had no liquid cash. Their wealth was in land, antiques, and titles, not bank accounts. So when a father or grandfather passed away, the family often had to sell off land, art, or even entire estates to pay the bill. This cycle repeated one generation after another. Each demise meant more money lost. With rising costs, fewer farm profits, and new taxes from industrial-friendly governments, the once powerful British upper class was suddenly scrambling to stay afloat. This heavy tax transformed noble families into struggling landlords, and the countryside never remained the same. Some opened their estates to tourists and even started sporting activities on the farmland. But at this point, the most obvious solution for many wealthy aristocrats was to marry wealthy American heiresses to survive. And it worked well for them because the wealthy Americans were also interested in their titles, just like Alva Vanderbilt was so obsessed with the Duke that she forced her daughter to marry him. With an arranged marriage like that involving the dollar princesses, the Americans were raising their social status, and the noble but broke men received the money they needed to maintain their estates and lifestyles, never having to work in their lives, just as they'd practiced their nobility over the years. During the Gilded Age, America was booming with wealth from railroads, steel, oil, and many others. The men behind this new money became rich fast, and their daughters, dressed in the finest silks, ready to be a part of the society. But there was one problem. Old New York society didn't want them. These girls were the daughters of self-made millionaires, not old families with deep roots, so the traditional elites looked down on them as new money and refused to let them into their private social circles. But across the ocean, in Britain, a solution was waiting. Many British aristocrats had fancy titles but empty pockets. Their grand estates were falling into disrepair, and they couldn't afford the necessary repairs. So when these cash-rich American heiresses showed up, it was a perfect match. The Americans got what money couldn't buy in the US, a noble title and access to one of the most exclusive clubs in the world. And the British got the money they desperately needed to save their ancestral homes. But despite how perfect the matchmaking looks, it wasn't always a happy exchange. As we've seen in the Gilded Age with Gladys and the Duke, these dollar princesses quickly realized castle life wasn't all luxury. Many of the grand homes lacked modern plumbing and heating. A bath could mean a maid carrying hot water up 4 stairs. So the American wives started making changes, modernizing their homes, updating the decorations, and trying to make life more comfortable. But that didn't sit well with their new in-laws. The British upper class saw them as outsiders who didn't understand tradition. They mocked their accents, laughed at their manners, and called them names behind their backs, and they were very ungrateful, even though the same Americans saved them from noble poverty. Still, it was worth it for many women, especially their mothers, who initiated and supported this exchange. Back home, no American woman could be born into royalty, but in Britain, with a title in hand, they had entered a world of dukes, duchesses, balls, and royal connections. At the same time, they had to deal with snobs and sacrifice some comforts as they watched their money restore the lost fortunes of the European aristocrats.